The Isle of Pelisse, Part 2, The Battle of Cloverfield. The Earl of Westwood had received an education appropriate for one of his social status. He had studied military strategy. He had attended military parades and dined and imbibed with military men in various officers' messes. His title conferred upon him a high military rank, and he considered that he looked rather dashing in his military uniform. But the Battle of Holzheim was his first experience of actual fighting, and he flattered himself that he had done rather well. Although the 2nd Light Dragoons had been destroyed as a fighting force, the Medium Guard had suffered a similar fate. On that basis, honours were even. But as the army of Westwood had retained possession of the field, he considered that the victory was his. He was confident that Princess Aphilia would now see the error of her ways, surrender her realm to him, and accept his proposal of marriage. He was sorely mistaken. Princess Aphilia had no thought in her head of capitulating either her realm or her person to the Earl of Westwood. She had been elated by the daring and dash of the 2nd Hildemead Hussars as they had slashed the 2nd Light Dragoons into shreds. She had been dismayed by the destruction of the Medium Guard, but her dominant emotion was a deep-seated determination to teach the Earl that she was not a woman with whom he could take liberties. She retreated to Needham and readied her defences, hoping that the reinforcements sent to her by King Ludwig would arrive before the Earl and his army. Had the Earl of Westwood acted promptly, it seems likely that Needham would have fallen to him. But he did not. He was initially delayed waiting for Brigadier Hapgood and the Earl's own regiment of foot to locate their ammunition supply and rejoin the main invasion force. He then waited several days more, confidently expecting the arrival of diplomats dispatched by the princess, tasked with negotiating a cessation of hostilities and terms of surrender. Finally, when these expectations were disappointed, he and his army moved slowly through the woodlands beyond Holzheim. By 14th May, he had reached the edge of the forest. Before him, the road ran through the sunlit meadows of Hildemead, direct to Needham, but the road was not clear. A hostile army was advancing along it toward him. And then things got worse for the Earl. The 1st Light Dragoons rode, travel-stained and weary, into his camp, and informed him that a large force led by King Ludwig had marched into woodlands which had been vacated, without a fight, by its outnumbered defenders. The Earl did not sleep well that night. He found himself occupying a central position between the army of King Ludwig and that of Princess Aphilia. He recalled from the military textbooks he had read that this was a strong position, enabling him to strike at each of his foes in turn and defeat them in detail. But it did not feel like he had the advantage. It felt like he was isolated and surrounded. His initial reaction was that he should immediately march back toward Woodlands and defend his lands from the incursion of King Ludwig. However, he was first faced with the problem of Princess Aphilia's army. He would have to deal with that as a priority. He arose early in the morning and deployed his forces for battle. Alongside the road, situated just on the edge of the forest, stood the imposing mansion known as Cloverfield Hall. Here the Earl of Westwood established his command post. To his right he positioned the Hildemouth Fusiliers, with the heavy cavalry of the Westwood Horse Guards protecting their flank. The Earl's own regiment of foot was stationed on the left, along with the 1st Light Dragoons. In front of the Earl, the road ran straight across the verdant plain. From the road branched a track leading to the small village of Cloverfield, off to the Earl's left. Further down the road stood the cottages constituting the hamlet of Hedgenettle, and marching past the cottages was the approaching and augmented army of Princess Aphilia. For the princess had not waited for reinforcements in vain. King Ludwig had sent the 2nd Regiment of his royal foot guards and the king's light horse to her assistance, and although it had taken these forces longer than anticipated to negotiate the heavily forested southern shores of Hilderwater, they had eventually managed to complete the journey to Needham. The Earl of Westwood watched the white-clad ranks of the 2nd Regiment of Royal Foot Guards marching along the road toward him. To their right, the king's light horse trotted through the fields, also uniformed in white. On their left rode the 2 squadrons of the Hildermead Hussars, resplendent in pink. And behind the 2 squadrons of Hussars rode Princess Aphilia, elegantly clad in a military-style jacket and long riding skirt, mounted side saddle, her head uncovered, her blonde hair rippling in the wind. Bugles sounded, and the horses of the Hildermead Hussars broke into a gallop, pounding across the plain, charging toward the Earl's right flank. The Westwood Horse Guards moved forward in order to counter this threat. In the centre, the Royal Foot Guards continued to advance along the road toward the Earl's line of infantry, who held position. There was no immediate threat to the Earl's left flank, as the king's light horse had come to a halt by the houses of Hedgenettle, where they milled aimlessly about. The commanding officer of the Light Dragoons was Major Montmorency. To date, he had not enjoyed this war. He had been posted as commander of the holding force, which had ignominiously retreated from Woodlands. And although he had not been present, he was still smarting from the destruction of his 2nd squadron at the Battle of Holzheim. But now he saw an opportunity for glory by performing a sweeping manoeuvre of the type so beloved by light cavalry. He ordered the 1st Light Dragoons to swing out to his left, looking to ride around the far side of the village of Cloverfield and charge into the flank of Princess Aphilia's army. Meanwhile, the 2 squadrons of the Hildermead Hussars had deployed into line and, closely followed by an exhilarated Princess Aphilia, were galloping full tilt toward the Westwood Horse Guards. The Horse Guards did not falter, but keeping a tight formation, continued to advance at a brisk trot, straight into the 2nd squadron of the onrushing Hussars. The Westwood Horse Guards were confident of victory. After all, they had previously seen off the 2nd squadron of the Hildermead Hussars at the Battle of Holzheim. But the 2nd squadron of the Hildermead Hussars had a point to prove. They put up a spirited resistance, fighting the heavy cavalry to a standstill, and then driving them back in disarray. As the heavy cavalry attempted to reform their line, the exuberant Hussars charged full pelt into them and, with much slaughter, swept them aside. So things were going well for the Hildermead Hussars. Not so for the king's light horse, whose officers had finally managed to form them into a line and were preparing to resume their advance. What they had not prepared for was the 1st Light Dragoons, who unexpectedly charged headlong into their flank, Major Montmorency at their head. The king's light horse took a dreadful mauling and fled the field. Major Montmorency reluctantly restrained his men from the pursuit. Sabring fleeing foes was always a pleasure, but galloping after the departing dragoons would leave the Earl of Westwood without any serviceable cavalry, and that would not do. he had the bugles sounded and called the troopers back to the colours. The second squadron of the Hildemede Hussars was in a similar situation, its ranks having become disordered during the destruction of the Westward Horse Guards. While the second squadron reformed into military order, Princess Aphilia sent the first squadron forward to menace the Hildemouth Fusiliers. The Fusiliers formed square, which served to discourage the Hussars, who contented themselves with lurking dangerously within charging distance, but out of musket range. All this time, the 2nd Regiment of the Royal Foot Guards of King Ludwig, the Lord of the lands between the lakes, had continued to advance down the road toward the Earl's own regiment of foot, forming into column of attack as they did so. Brigadier Hapgood rather resented what he regarded as an intolerable insolence, and ordered the Earl's own regiment to advance toward the Foot Guards, maintaining a line formation in order to maximise the effect of the regiment's firepower. There was a thunderous exchange of volleys, following which the Earl's own regiment charged into the Royal Foot Guards, only to be rudely repulsed with cold steel. The Earl of Westward had already seen the cream of his cavalry given a good whipping. He now witnessed the discomfiture of his personal soldiery, the elite of his army. Dismayed and disheartened, he ordered that the retreat be sounded. Further down the road, by the hamlet of Hedgenettle, the 2nd Hildemede Hussars and the 1st Light Dragoons, having both regrouped and redressed their ranks, were manoeuvring around each other, each seeking to gain a position of advantage. Hearing the Earl's bugler blowing the call to retreat, Major Montmorency ordered his men to disengage, and they rode back the way they had come, circling around the far side of Cloverfield village. The 2nd Hildemede Hussars followed them at a cautious distance, wary of riding into a trap. Meanwhile, both the Hildemouth Fusiliers and the Earl's own regiment had formed into compact columns and were falling back into the woods. The 1st Hildemede Hussars continued to loiter in the vicinity of the Hildemouth Fusiliers, but took no aggressive action. They had previously attempted to charge these gentlemen at the Battle of Holzheim, and that had not worked so well. Although the men of the 2nd Royal Foot Guards had bested the Earl's own regiment in their battle of bayonets, they had suffered considerable casualties in doing so. Reluctant to provoke another encounter, they stood their ground and watched the Earl's infantry withdraw. So it was that the Earl's army was able to extricate itself from the field without suffering any further damage. And thus ended the Battle of Cloverfield.